Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Yes, so as just mentioned, I've been not even 3 months in the job yet as the head of the department for regulated product in EFSA. So what I can provide you with is a newcomer view of where I have landed. So don't expect me to be on top of the expertise on the 35 pieces of legislation that EFSA is dealing with. But I think the fresh eye has some benefit, and I'm going to use this in my presentation. I'll say a word about EFSA, very quick. Anyway, I don't have so many slides. I tried to group a little bit my first impression of getting to the world of chemicals in food, and seeing how that can be arranged in themes. First theme is the going granular, how more refined the risk assessment is developing. In conjunction with this, in the other direction, the scope of the risk assessment is also expanding in a number of directions, so that's the big picture. And a final aspect is the timeline at which we look, the time scale at which we look at the risk assessment is also becoming more encompassing, anticipating and closing the loop. And finally, very important, being heard. Let's see when I get there. A lot has been said already this morning, but I think this is absolutely critical for us. EFSA, so European Food Safety Authority in the north of Italy, Parma. A number of staff, but even more importantly, connection with outside experts. EFSA is made of staff, the secretariat, and expert panels, which are also EFSA. 200 experts in our panels, but many more experts in looser networks and cooperation. Total of 1,500 experts, links with research universities and institutes. All of this to produce scientific output, whether they are opinion on pre-market authorization or guidance or ad hoc request mandates coming to us. And as I mentioned, one of the great complexity in EFSA is dealing with 35 pieces of legislation. Okay, the 3 jobs of EFSA: advising, that's very important. We are risk assessor by opposition with the risk manager. So the risk manager mandate us with questions, and we provide opinions for the risk manager, being the European Commission or the member states, typically, to decide how to handle, how to manage the risk. Also, in our funding regulation communication, and that's where the being heard is important, the communication about to the European public about the risk that we are assessing, and collaboration, building network with member states, with other risk assessment and risk management communities to provide support. So 3 missions in the legislation. As I said, the scope is very broad, and that's reflected by the different panels we have. The one which are interested for today are the one dealing with chemicals, pesticides, plant protection, animal feed, chemical contaminants, food additive, food packaging. So five panels directly concerned with chemicals. So getting to risk assessment and really what's happening and therefore what we can see coming also in the coming years in risk assessment, I think there is clearly a refining of the granularity of the risk assessment. We see that in many aspects. We've seen in previous presentations how detailed we go into the mechanisms of toxicity, but it's true also in other aspects of risk assessment. If we think of environmental risk assessment, EFSA published a scientific opinion last year on specific environmental protection goals, driving the environmental risk assessment to be more and more refined, both in what effect to consider, looking at sublethal effects on population and ecosystems, but also looking really at the detail of environmental condition. And we had last week in EFSA conference on environmental risk assessment, with a big theme being landscape-based pesticide risk assessment, because EU has a huge variety of landscapes, of ecological conditions. You know, the grass is still growing in Parma, and it's not really the case here. It's kind of brown around. So how to take into account this huge diversity, climate, geological, geographical, agricultural practices, all of this is now fed into models more and more sophisticated. The other point about getting more granular is the detail at which we isolate the different target groups. We heard a little bit about specific focus on infant, toddlers, babies, young children, and that's really much taken up. There is guidance in preparation on how to look at the specifics of those groups, not only on their vulnerability because of the specificity of the growing organism and the metabolism, but also on their exposure, their consumption habits. They of course have very different consumption habit compared to the rest of the population. And same idea of targeting more and more the risk assessment. EFSA is also moving into the direction of isolating specific vulnerable species when doing environmental risk assessment. So the non-target organisms of the pesticides, really looking at the ones which are of most concern to be able to refine the risk assessment opinion. And all of this, of course, is pushed forward by the use of big data. In toxicology, of course, we heard about this, but also in any single area you can think of, the GIS systems, but also more and more data on how people consume their food, which becomes available. So bigger data and more powerful models to be able to take advantage of these data models, which become so complex that no single one person can master them. So we are reaching very high level of complexity. I think this is a very important aspect also. I will come back on this later on. In conjunction with this granularity, there is also going in the other direction, widening the scope even more, and that was mentioned already. I will not come back a lot on this. Exposure to multi-chemicals together. For us in EFSA, it's of course the pesticides. Work ongoing to develop models, risk assessment models that take into account both the diversity of the landscape, but also the diversity of the active substances. This is true in other aspects, looking at food contact material, which so far is coming from a past of looking at substance by substance. What is the substance we want to manage, but now looking more at what is really coming out of the food contact material, what is expected, but also anything else which we not necessarily expected, like all the impurities coming from the processing, the degradation product of the material, and so forth. So the non-intentionally added substances. Something to mention is the story of pesticide co-formulants. I think it's important also when we think of the global picture of risk assessment is the fragmentation we have in the legislation, where different authorities, different agencies are looking at different aspects, and each providing the answer for what they have been asked about. And sometimes we are left a little bit wondering where is the big picture being collated, and that's a little bit the story with pesticide, and we are now moving forward with looking not only at the active substance, but also as whatever else is made, is added to the active substance to make the final product, which we know has also an effect. In the same direction of big picture, multiple sources of exposure, and we heard about that, a much better slide than mine, thinking about really what is the total dose an individual is exposed to, not only what we are looking at as food, but you know, we had the story recently, well, recently it emerged, but it's a long story, of course. You think of a food additive as titanium dioxide. We can evaluate it in EFSA as a food additive, but of course, it's also coming under different form. It's for instance, in cosmetics, in toiletry, toothpaste, and yeah, depending on how you look at it, well, the dose you have to consider is very different. So again, different risk assessment actors can come with different answers, but simply because they are looking at different questions. Multiple source of exposure, also extending the number of food contact materials that are being harmonized at EU level. Today, few of them are harmonized at EU level. A lot of them are looked at individually by member state, but there is definitely work going in this direction of a more encompassing look at all food contact material. And finally, on this big picture idea is, well, beyond, going from one single chemical to multiple chemicals, and then going even to multiple stressors, because an environmental system is not only submitted to, if we look at pesticide risk assessment, to multiple pesticides, it's also submitted to other stressors. A good example of this is the work currently developing in EFSA on the health status of bee colonies. So we know bees are affected by other things than just neonicotinoids and other pesticides. And that's, all the other stressors that can be affecting. So difficulty comes from not just looking at things in isolation. Other aspect of increasing the scope of closing the loop, of increasing the scope of the risk assessment, it's closing the loop. And here it's anticipating the future food contaminants. Because a new material today, a new technology today, nanotechnology to name one, are the contaminants of tomorrow, more or less, depending on how on their properties and how we manage them also. And one of the difficulty we have here, if we think plastics, is that yes, now it's clear plastics are food contaminants, but we don't have data for regulatory risk assessment and regulatory risk management. We have a lot of data, but more research data. For risk assessment, we need very specific data, very controlled design of experiments. And same for risk management, where we need, or even for risk assessment, we need also exposure consumption patterns, which are difficult to get on those emerging contaminants. That leads also, that was mentioned before, to the challenge of the circular economy. How to those contaminants, once they are in the circular economy, they will stay there, or they can even, new contaminants can come in the life cycle and being in a way accumulated in the cycle. Yes, okay. Pre-market authorization, yes, we have this for food, that's the legislation, regulated product, but it's not really the case for industrial chemicals, so that's why it's very important to have this screening and early warning. We talked earlier about emerging risk, and to have networks and to have systems in place to understand where are the next risk for the food supply chain. Post-market monitoring, which on some legislation is mandatory, GMO, but not necessarily for all legislation. If we think pesticides, we measure residue, but we don't really look at what is really the impact, what is really the residual risk after the risk assessment. And then substitution, we mentioned with the circular economy. Once you substitute, you change a hazard which you knew you didn't accept for a hazard which maybe you don't know so much, or even for the identity of a chemical you don't know so much about. And then final point on being heard. Yes, and we had a very good presentation this morning on the future trends for consumers. And that's clearly something which is being felt by all regulators and very acutely in EFSA, how, because of sometimes misguided pressure, we are forced to work on the wrong things, or not the most priority topics, and also how the advice we give is not listened to, because we didn't manage to communicate it properly. So effort of communication, but I think it's also effort here to start with among ourselves, the regulator, to make sure that we don't send confusing messages, which then are very difficult to clean up. Transparency will help, more and more publication. We are publishing data, but the difficulty here is how to do this transparency while still fostering innovation and a competitive EU. We have a very interesting European Court of Justice case coming out yesterday, which we could talk about later. And engaging the public. We are doing things in EFSA, the hackathon, on how do they want to be engaged, what do they want to know, and what tools do they want to have. Starting consultation very early in the work of risk assessment, even on the design. What does the public want us to look at, how to frame the questions. And yes, the collaborating between authorities. As I was mentioning, the landscape of regulatory, of actors is very fragmented. So it's important not only for efficiency and consistency, but also to make sure we send the right message, that we do collaborate. And the guidance on endocrine disruptor, ECHA, EFSA, it's a good start in this direction. And that's my conclusion. We are getting more and more sophisticated in the risk assessment in both dimensions, going to the very fine and going to the macro scale, which is adding to the complexity of the communication. Also, if we think there was a slide about increase of the stupid consumer, well, this is not helping. Less and less attention on complex things, and things are becoming more and more complex. But we definitely need to tackle this, otherwise whatever we do will have no value. The action program will remain action and not results. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.